You think you know, but you have no idea of the depths of your ignorance. Allow me to demonstrate that all of life's questions and queries can be reasonably proven to resolution, using facts, reasonable assumptions, explanations, and proper context, and profess that philosophy and reason can be used to answer all of life's remaining questions with accuracy. I'm one-man think tank Jason V. Human, founder of Axiom TV and the School of Axial Thought. The challenge for this episode: why the alt-right and American Renaissance are all wrong. Now, before we delve into this matter, there are a few things to keep in mind and take into account. Some facts of nature, as well as some things worth mentioning. What is worth mentioning is this is an informal cerebral exercise created by a member of the people for the empowerment of the people. Forgive what may seem an oversimplification of the issue. It's how I talk. My explanation is somewhat esoteric, but being that human beings are also of nature, then we and what we create and express are also. Full disclaimer, I am black, but I assure you, I have taken painstaking care to use predominantly Western logic and examples to oppose this issue. I would also add as a footnote that many of my good friends are white. I have no problem with white people individually, only conceptually. Though this is a video responding to the pronouncements of the alt-right and American Renaissance, it is unavoidable that it is a response to racism itself, making it unnecessary to respond to each organization individually. Between you and me, I find the subject trivial in contrast to the actual challenging questions in life. To effectively deconstruct the subject, I will have to go off on a few tangents, but will only do so out of necessity. These tangents will briefly touch on topics that encompass both overt and covert institutional control and coping mechanisms of human society. Being that these topics exist as contradictions, worthy of being topics of focus in and of themselves, we won't go into them at length here, but in their own dedicated videos. Now, as for some facts of nature, keep in mind that human beings, each person is first a sensory being. We are predisposed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is why a child first desires its mother's milk, to engage in the pleasure of satisfying a need. By default, we are instinctively attuned to seek and gravitate to sounds, images, smells, individuals, etc. that we find pleasing to us. In other words, our subconscious pathology is to hear what we want to hear and desire for the most pleasurable sensations for all of our senses. And yes, human beings do have the ability of choice, but that choice has to overcome some of our default settings. We are more emotional than cerebral, as the response to this video will show, meaning that our emotions tend to drive our decision, more so than intellect. We are gullible, for purpose of adapting, impressionable, which is why there is marketing, advertising, why sponsors decide what shows stay on the air, not the networks, as the Bill O'Reilly scandal showed. We justify our actions in one way or another before we act them out. Our justifications for these actions are not always rational ones. Moving on to truth. The truth is reality, and reality hurts at times, varying in its intensity, depending on one's level of emotional attachment. This being the case, we as human beings experience a fight or flight reflex. If truth does not align to what we find favorable in our perception, we tend to avoid or attack it with irrational and emotional efforts or shut down in suspension of belief. Much of the population engage in the practice of an unexamined life and have done so for a protracted amount of time. Just because we want to believe something to be true, or because that belief is popular, does not make it true. Keep in mind, for something to be true, it has to actually be so. Human beings are a social species. Though we are conditioned to believe that we exist solely based on our individual interests, our individual interest is secondary to our collective societal interest. Combining all of that in the equation, I bring this matter before you to truth. Now we'll get into a pair of societal axioms that we must also be mindful of. To understand racism, one must understand that it follows from a series of unfortunate concepts. Preceding it is control, getting the collection of minds and bodies to do as you desire them to do. The conqueror and the conquered dynamic. Privilege, laziness, fear, delusion of grandeur is the destination we'll arrive to. Fundamentally, racism today exists as it did from its inception, based in economy and control, coping societal mechanics. For the few who are actually in command of society, the state and the super wealthy, it is a part of divide and conquer controls. For the majority, it is a warning to the entire population not to get out of line, as well as a means for them to project pinned-up frustration. When you see what you are told is your own group, what they are willing to do to others, based only on appearance, a message is received by each individual on a subconscious level. Naturally, each considers and comes to the realization that in some circumstance this could happen to them as well. At this point, control is established. That fear is then rationalized by the individual for sake of survival and redirected into doing the tyrant's bidding, going so far as to see things their way, not only figuratively, but literally as well. This is why you have two people reviewing the same set of facts and coming to stark contrast in regards to racial issues. For members of the majority majority. It is a form of adaptation, making the best of the situation in a way. While their rulers abuse them, the dominant population is themselves easier for their power center to control, given they have blacks or some group dubbed the minority to oppress day to day. French philosopher Michel Foucault noticed that blacks served as the scapegoat or collateral damage in some sense, and that this was one of their primary functions in the Western conceptualizations. The same reason that Abraham Lincoln gave for the cause of the Civil War, the country lacking an enemy at the time, is the role that Foucault is referring to. The very word human is racist in itself, as well as misogynistic. Are we just a shade of color? Is what qualifies a human being ultimately their gender? In the eyes of the Western world, blacks primarily, but women as well, are the enemy, though never having earned the ire of such label. What's behind racism is the fact that it is a multi-trillion-dollar-a-year industry. This is really why the propaganda of earth-toned people being the enemy is maintained. I'm sure each white person has done a cost-benefit analysis of racism along their way in life. For those who actively engage in it, they only see society from that narrow vantage. I prefer to view the matter through the lens of actual opportunity costs. A culture is not what a state espouses to be. That is only perception. The reality is that culture is and are established patterns of behaviors during the lifetime of said nation state. When we think of culture, we tend to think of it as behavior that is natural to us. Truth be told, culture is not inherent. At this moment, you are not the real you. You are a cultural representative of yourself. Culture is a set of instructions, a template of how a population is to conduct itself and seeks to extend to every aspect in life. Culture tells a populace how to be, what we are to conform to. It is passed down from the generation before, or in general, the power center of a nation state. It exists more as suggestive hypnosis, a set of rules that compels populations to self-police themselves. This results in even the professed freest nation states' freedom being only a mirage. Culture is the game of Simon Says. Now, I am not saying that culture is not capable of being originated organically. It is. What I'm saying is that there is a prevailing culture emanating from the ruling few that dictates or influences the echoing subsequent cultures that originate from within the populace. For the record, I do not think that any group should be racially based ultimately, but based on quality of actions. This concept has been forced on society by the power center of it, and being that whites have materially benefited the most, they should be the first to disband such groups until they have organically assimilated into multicultural groups centered in merit. Going back in order, essentially, racism is a cultural control device that has been forced on the human population. We all really know that our ultimate redeeming quality that identifies each of us isn't our so-called ethnicity. If racism was real, whites would never hurt or oppress each other. They would only do so to other races. But every white person knows this is not the case. If racism were real, whites wouldn't have to be convinced as to what their culture is. They would just innately act it out without anyone ever having to remind them how to do so. That aside, now to bring the topic of order to truth. Responding to the alt-right and American Renaissance. Superficially, both groups seem to have nuanced differences, such as in appearance, target demographic, and method. The alt-right seeks to appeal to a younger audience. They appear clean, well-dressed, and sophisticated, and are high visibility on the internet. They have an official hairstyle, a cartoon meme of Pepe the Frog as an official logo, and hand gesture to elicit belonging, going as far to differentiate themselves by saying that they don't seek to dominate other races, particularly blacks, but merely physically separate themselves. Though the American Renaissance also dresses professionally and has a presence on the internet, they target the middle-aged and older crowd, which eventually influences the young. Their marketing harkens back to days of old-school overt racism, with messages that either teeter the edge or crosses the line outright. Exhaustive sessions are spent focused on convincing the audience of black inferiority. They clearly are about that hate life and seek to engage in subscription of action. Ultimately, at some point while sharing their propaganda, both the alt-right and American Renaissance end up sounding equally crude and callous, antiquated if you will, which makes sense, being that both are white nationalist organizations that promote themselves as solutions to the issues that confront Western civilization. They state their platforms in identity politics, a form of white pride, said to be self-love more than hate for others. Their shared objective is achieving an all-white state, white utopia. They both desire white privilege. Similarly, they have charismatic frontmen as their leading protagonists, Richard Spencer and Jared Harvey, respectively. On a side note, while studying these men, I caught myself thinking of prosperity preachers Joel Osteen and the late Billy Graham. program, but I digress. For those who gravitate toward this variety of coping mechanism, groups like these sound very appealing. Though considered to be on the fringe of society, these types of organizations have a substantial following, which makes their philosophy, gripes, and claims worth looking over. First point of their program is identity. Both are entrenched in what is referred to as identity politics, meaning race. Identity politics is racial politics. Their entire ideology follows after being white. That aspect alone of their argument reveals much of what you need to know about these groups. It renders them no different than any other of these types of groups, whether they refer to themselves as white power, white pride, white separatist, white supremacy, and so on. All of these groups share a common foundation. They root their identity on race. On this point of matter alone, they find themselves indefensibly vulnerable. First point of contention. Beauty is subjective. The aesthetically pleasing whites do not rule over your own society. So let's kill the notion that there is substance in mere appearance. I ask these persons to step back and view nature, which is supreme to all, including a nation state or the super wealthy. Considering natural order, merit is the ultimate decider, not a particular species' shade of pigment, especially within a common species. If someone wants to say human beings are more complex creatures, then I'd say so complex are we that we decided to base merit on a quality outside of it. I find trouble drawing parallels to high-level thinking in that regard. Regardless of race, merit is the ultimate identity of each person. Each individual is primarily distinguished by ability, not their ethnicity. Is this not why you have good and bad in every stock, smart and remedial, etc.? To use an example in nature, though our skin is the largest organ of our bodies, it is only a few millimeters in thickness. We are a composition of much more complexity in between. The heart, the brain, the lungs, and the stomach do not quibble over which is supreme. They simply work in concert to achieve their goal of keeping each of us alive, capable to perform all of the functions that goes along with being alive. By rooting yourselves in appearance, relegates your arguments in the realm of apparition, make-believe, play-along. You invite delusion, like the residents of Plato's cave. Delusion plays off of imagination, which is a necessary feature of our minds as human beings. But when forcefully engaging in the same delusion, eventually brings one to extended delusions of grandeur, which at its core is what racism or any concept of supremacy is. The need to convince others, as well as yourself, that you are beautiful. The need to prop up one's self-esteem artificially by forcefully degrading others is the pathology of a fragile psyche. This condition is not just exclusive to skinheads and KKK members. This extends out to the majority of the white race. This is why Western society, steeped in its purported values, functions primarily on appearance rather than substance. Beneath the veneer of decadence is a machine of exploitation and structural deception. The very fact that one bases the quality of their worth in life on appearance is an admission of no actual endearing qualities they feel worthy of attributing themselves to. Privilege. What happened to competition in the free market? The notion of privilege, the center of gravity for the notion of privilege is in laziness, fear, and insecurity. I have nothing against privilege for those who earn such privilege. Being white is not a talent, nor an accomplishment. Of all of nature's creatures to exhibit this behavior, the closest is parasite larvae. Unearned privilege is a form of bailout, or welfare. These groups are pandering for white privilege. Privilege is cheating. It is an undeserved advantage. Mathematically, privilege is abruptly limited. There is only so much of it to go around. There is only so much world to conquer. Only so many people and resources to exploit. There are limits that will forcefully leave you to consider them, if not thoughtfully done beforehand. This is where white privilege, as well as the concept of racism, fail horribly. Notice their platform is never merit. Continuing with identity. If your beef is with other white people, why base your ideology in identity? Western powers virtually rule human society, and have done so for a duration of time now. Your gripe is with more privileged whites, yet you attack such groups as social justice warriors, Black Lives Matter, and feminists. You said your enemy is other whites, establishment whites. By rooting your program in appearance against a more powerful opponent who is also steeped in appearance, isn't the end game still appearances? In terms of victimhood, isn't this also victimhood? In that, by basing your self-worth in appearance, you are essentially admitting that your other qualities are inferior to other races, which led to you having to rely on race in the first place to distinguish yourselves. A clear inferiority complex. The fact that both of these groups lost. You're admitting defeat in your approach to your challenge. By aligning yourself with such symbols and ideology, one is engaging in self-defeating conduct. Last but not least, genealogical Biologically speaking, all races of human beings are 99.9% genetically the same. Every human being alive currently grew out of African, or so referred to as Negroid, ancestry. The implications are clear. Every race of human being alive today is fundamentally black. There are no whites or other races without blacks producing them. Engaging in racism is akin to oppressing one's parent. There has been a lot of valuable time expended to avoid this fact, but with all of those innumerable amount of resources, here is where we find ourselves. I'm envisioning the image of a dog chasing its tail. For some odd reason. Blacks are the genetic anchor of human beings. No one should feel ashamed for it, nor inferior. Keeping in the genealogical sphere, racists share a belief of racial purity. Some will go as far as to say that anyone not of pure white blood is a degenerate. What fails here is the realization that, mathematically, such a notion becomes incest, the sharing and furthering of recessive genes. Solely reproducing within the confines of one's race would eventually only produce degenerative offspring. Is this not the case? This concludes part 1 of my response. Why the alt-right and American Renaissance is a true equivalent to being all wrong.